For centuries, Viking longships were the nightmare of Europe's shores. Their sails meant fire in the thatch, chains around the neck, and villages erased before dawn. From Lindisfarne to Constantinople, no frontier seemed safe from Norse raiders who turned the sea itself into a weapon. But in the Baltic, the story twisted. Here, the wolves of the north met hunters of their own. Slavic tribes known as the Wends mastered the coasts better than the Norse, built shallow draft ships that could slip where longboats grounded, and turned familiar waters into traps waiting to be sprung. These were not scattered raids, but a piracy system forged from desperation and perfected through innovation. Fortified island bases gave them safe havens, cavalry ships allowed lightning strikes inland, and ambush tactics let them bleed Viking trade until the predators became prey. Even hardened Norse crews, once the terror of Europe, now feared to sail their home waters. This is the forgotten story of the Wendish pirates, the Slavic raiders who turned the Baltic from a Viking highway into a sea the Norse themselves learned to fear. The year 1000 marked more than just a new millennium. Across Scandinavia, something fundamental was changing. The Vikings, who had terrorized Europe for 3 centuries, were laying down their weapons and picking up crosses. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway had converted to Christianity. Denmark's Harald Bluetooth had done the same decades earlier. One by one, the great Viking lords were abandoning the old ways. When Norse Vikings became Christian and ended their piracy in the 11th century, they left behind more than just empty longship harbours. They created a power vacuum in the Baltic Sea that someone would inevitably fill. The lucrative trade routes, the undefended merchant ships, the established slave markets, all of this remained, but without Viking fleets to control it. The tribes positioned to seize this opportunity lived along the southern shores of the Baltic Sea. The Wends, as their neighbours called them, were not a unified people but a collection of West Slavic tribes, Obotrites, Leutisians, Pomeranians and Rani. Each controlled different stretches of coastline, from the Elbe River in the west to the Oder in the east. For generations they had watched Viking ships pass their shores, carrying wealth stolen from distant lands. But the Wends faced a critical problem that would drive them to piracy. Baltic Slavs had agriculture that was not highly developed in the early 7th century. They were in dire need of resources, since the dry islets of southwestern Baltic were the only ones capable of cultivation and cattle were scarce. The harsh reality was simple: their land could not support their people. These tribes had been raiding their neighbours for survival long before the Vikings disappeared. What changed after 1000 was the scale of opportunity. With Viking piracy ending, the Baltic's wealth was there for the taking. The Wends had spent centuries learning their craft in the shadow of the Norse. Now it was their turn to terrorize the sea. The transition wasn't immediate. For decades, both Christian Vikings and pagan Wends operated in the same waters, but by 1050, the pattern was clear. Pagan pirates from the Baltics were raiding the coasts of the now Christian Sweden and Finland. The student had become the master. The Baltic Sea was not the North Atlantic. Its countless islands, hidden reefs, and shifting sandbanks created a maritime maze that demanded intimate local knowledge. Viking longships, designed for oceanic voyages and river penetration, were poorly suited for this environment. Their deeper drafts and heavier construction worked against them in Baltic coastal waters. Wendish shipbuilders understood their home waters in ways no foreign sailor could match. They crafted vessels specifically for Baltic conditions. Ships that were similar to Viking longships, but faster, and built in far greater numbers. These shallow draft boats could navigate waters that would ground a traditional Viking vessel. The geography gave Wends decisive tactical advantages. They could retreat into coastal shallows where pursuers couldn't follow. They could use the complex archipelagos as natural fortresses, disappearing into waterways that only they knew how to navigate. A Viking fleet pursuing Wendish raiders into these waters was like a pack of wolves chasing rabbits into a burrow. Wendish knowledge of currents, tides, and seasonal patterns allowed them to predict exactly when and where merchant ships would appear. They knew which routes traders took to avoid storms, which islands provided shelter, and which passages offered the best ambush points. This intelligence network was built over generations of local seamanship. The speed advantage was crucial. Wendish ships could appear without warning, strike quickly, and vanish before any organized response could form. Their vessels carried smaller crews than Viking warships, making them more maneuverable and requiring fewer resources to maintain. But when they attacked in coordinated groups, their numbers were overwhelming. By the mid-11th century, this geographic mastery had transformed the Baltic from a Viking highway into a Wendish hunting ground. The same waters that had once carried Norse raiders to distant shores now belonged to a new generation of pirates who understood every rock, current, and hiding place. The most revolutionary Wendish innovation was something no Viking had ever attempted. Each Wendish vessel could carry 2 horses, allowing for rapid inland attacks once ashore. This combination of naval mobility and cavalry firepower created a new form of warfare that caught their enemies completely unprepared. Traditional naval raids required attackers to fight on foot once they landed. Vikings were skilled warriors, but on land they moved at the speed of marching men. Wendish raiders, by contrast, could land their horses and immediately transform into a mobile cavalry force capable of striking deep inland before defenders could organize resistance. The tactical advantages were immense. A Wendish fleet could appear off a coastline at dawn, land horses and riders within minutes, and have mounted warriors galloping toward inland targets before anyone realized an attack was underway. By the time local forces could muster, the raiders were already returning to their ships with captives and plunder. These fleets were mobile cavalry units carrying horses and riders, quickly able to make landfall and sweep the countryside. The logistics were carefully planned. Ships carried not just warriors and horses, but also feed, water, and equipment needed for extended operations. Landing sites were scouted in advance to ensure rapid deployment. The psychological impact was devastating. Coastal settlements had to worry not just about harbours and beaches, but about any target within several hours' ride of the shoreline. Wendish cavalry could strike monasteries, farms, and even fortified positions that had never faced seaborne assault. The range of vulnerable targets expanded dramatically. King Ratibor of the Wends once commanded a fleet of 550 ships, carrying over 1,000 cavalry. This was no ordinary raiding party, but a mobile army capable of striking anywhere along the Baltic coast with a speed and shock few had ever faced before. No Viking force had ever achieved this level of combined naval and land warfare capability. The innovation spread throughout Wendish culture. Training young warriors meant teaching them to fight both as sailors and horsemen. Shipbuilders designed vessels specifically to accommodate horses while maintaining speed and maneuverability. The entire military culture adapted around this tactical revolution. On the windswept cliffs of Rügen Island stood something unique in the medieval world, a fortress that was simultaneously a religious temple and a military command center. Arkona was a West Slavic citadel temple of the god Svantavit, dating from the 9th and 10th centuries. But it was far more than a place of worship. This 4-headed god was no mere spiritual symbol. Svantavit was the deity of war and abundance, and his priests made the strategic decisions that directed Wendish military campaigns. The highest-ranking position among the Rani tribe was that of the high priest, who stood above even the king. The oracle decided whether and where campaigns were to be mounted. Common decisions of the Wendish tribes were made only with the approval of the Rani. After a victory, the money and precious metals of any bounty were given to the temple before the rest was partitioned. This centralized wealth collection funded the massive fleets that terrorized the Baltic. Arkona was the engine of Wendish power, where strategy and wealth fused to keep the pirate fleets moving. The tribute system extended far beyond Wendish territory. Not only the whole land of Wends, but also Scandinavian neighbours paid tribute to Svantovit. Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus wrote that when the statue was finally destroyed, the Danes carried away 7 boxes of treasures that had been gifts to the god. This was no single raid's plunder, but the amassed fortune of an entire maritime empire. The temple complex functioned as an intelligence centre, where information from across the Baltic was collected and analysed. Merchants, fishermen and travellers brought news of ship movements, military preparations and vulnerable targets. Priests processed this information and issued orders to fleet commanders throughout Wendish territory. The transformation was complete by the mid-11th century. Wendish longboats were actively hunting Scandinavian Vikings, returning home with boats full of loot and slaves. The predators had become prey in their own waters. The hunting strategy was methodical. Wendish scouts monitored the traditional Viking routes, watching for ships heavy with plunder making their way back to Danish and Swedish ports. These returning raiders were perfect targets, laden with wealth, tired from long campaigns, and often undermanned after months of fighting. Wendish fleets positioned themselves at strategic choke points where geography forced Viking ships into predictable paths. The narrow passages between islands, the approaches to major harbours, the shelter points where ships waited out storms, all became killing grounds where patient Wendish crews waited for their prey. The attacks were swift and overwhelming. Multiple Wendish ships would converge on a single Viking vessel, using superior numbers to offset any advantage in individual fighting skill. The goal wasn't heroic single combat, but efficient wealth transfer. Viking crews found themselves outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1, facing enemies who knew every reef and current in the surrounding waters. The psychological warfare was deliberate. Wendish raiders made sure that survivors lived to tell their stories. Word spread through Scandinavian ports about crews that had vanished, ships that had been found empty and drifting, and the growing danger of sailing Baltic waters without heavy escort. The slave trade provided additional targets. When the Viking slave trade stopped in the mid-11th century, the old slave trade route between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea was upheld by pagan Baltic slave traders. Wendish fleets began intercepting these routes, capturing not just the human cargo, but the traders themselves. The scale of operations was massive. In 1135, Duke Ratibor commanded a force of 1,000 to 1,500 Pomeranian raiders on 50 to 70 boats during a major raid on the Norwegian city of Kungahella. In a successful raid on Kungahella, Pomeranians enslaved thousands. Snorri Sturluson wrote that Kungahella never recovered from the raid. This wasn't random piracy, but systematic economic warfare. The Wends were dismantling the Viking trade network and replacing it with their own. Every captured ship, every enslaved crew, every stolen cargo load weakened their former oppressors while strengthening Wendish power. By 1100, the transformation of the Baltic was so complete that the western Baltic was sometimes called Mare Rugienrum, the Rugian Sea, after the Slavic pirates of Rugen. The sea that had once been a Viking highway now belonged to the Wends. The impact on Scandinavian society was devastating. Coastal areas had been depopulated, churches built to double as refuges for the local population, and fjords blocked with stake barriers to keep pirate ships out. Wendish slave markets were said to be full of Danish captives for sale. Entire communities abandoned their ancestral homes and moved inland beyond the reach of Wendish cavalry raids. The prevalence of treasure hoarding in southern Sweden during the 1000s has led modern archaeologists to believe that the threat was indeed a very serious one. Families buried their valuables rather than risk losing them to Wendish raiders. The archaeological record shows a society under siege, hoarding wealth instead of displaying it. The economic disruption extended far beyond direct losses. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries became too dangerous to use. Merchants demanded escort vessels or refused to sail Baltic waters entirely. The cost of protection drove up prices for goods throughout Scandinavia. Danish and Swedish rulers found themselves paying tribute to Wendish chiefs to protect their own coastlines. The same Viking culture that had demanded tribute from monasteries and kingdoms across Europe was now paying protection money to Slavic pirates. The wheel had come full circle. The Icelandic sagas themselves often seem to assume that Vikings, in the purely piratical sense, were almost as likely to be Wends as Scandinavians. The very term Viking, which meant sea-born raider, not ethnic Scandinavian, had been appropriated by their former victims. For over a century, Wendish pirates had terrorized the Baltic with apparent impunity. Danish kings launched expedition after expedition against Wendish strongholds, but the raiders simply melted away into their coastal maze, returning to strike again when the threat passed. Military force alone seemed unable to break Wendish power. Then, nature intervened where human effort had failed. In 1157, a massive Wendish fleet of 1,500 ships was destroyed in a storm off the Norwegian coast. Survivors who washed ashore were shown no mercy by the locals. In a single night, the core of Wendish naval power was obliterated. The storm created an opportunity that Danish King Valdemar I was quick to seize. With the Wendish fleet devastated, he mounted an offensive against Rügen, which was the stronghold of the Rani. The sacred island that had directed Baltic piracy for generations was suddenly vulnerable. The siege of Arkona began on May 19, 1168, when Valdemar landed with his fleet, accompanied by his army commander and close friend, Bishop Absalon. The temple fortress that had seemed impregnable was protected on three sides by cliffs, and from the land side by a 25-meter-high berg wall. But the defenders faced a critical weakness: limited access to water. After 4 weeks of siege, the attackers succeeded in starting a fire at an unobserved point during daylight hours. The defenders could not put out the fire due to a shortage of water. On June 15, 1168, the temple fortress was taken. The wooden structure of consummate workmanship that had stood for centuries was finally breached. The destruction was systematic and symbolic. The temple was destroyed, and the Svantevit statue was chopped up and burned. The spiritual center that had coordinated Wendish resistance was deliberately desecrated. When the four-headed statue fell, so did the last organized pagan resistance in the Baltic. The wealth accumulated over generations of successful piracy was seized by the Danish forces. 7 boxes of treasures that had been gifts to Svantevit were carried away, along with the tribute that Scandinavian neighbors had been forced to pay. The economic foundation of Wendish power was transferred to their conquerors. The Wendish pirates made one last desperate raid in 1172, but they were decisively defeated at the Battle of Falster. Their heads were displayed as a grim warning throughout Danish territory. Wendish piracy was over. The sea that had been called Mare Rugianorum returned to Christian control. The fall of Arkona marked more than just a military victory. It represented the end of the last major pagan stronghold in northern Europe and the final phase of Christian expansion in the Baltic region. The Wends had demonstrated that Slavic peoples could rival the Vikings in seafaring, raiding, and military innovation. But they could not ultimately resist the combined pressure of Christian kingdoms backed by the resources of an expanding medieval Europe. The story of the Wendish pirates reveals something profound about the shifting balance of medieval power. For 3 centuries, Viking longships had haunted Europe's shores, their supremacy built on daring raids, superior ships, and ruthless innovation. Yet when the Norse laid down their oars for the cross, their old enemies did not rejoice in freedom. Into the silence of the seas came the Wends, once the hunted, now the hunters, proving that Viking dominance had never been about blood or legend, but about seizing the opportunities that the restless sea offered to those bold enough to claim them. The Wends turned the tools of their tormentors into weapons of their own. Their ships cut faster across the waves. Their cavalry and fleets struck together like storm and thunder. Their spies and commanders wove networks that rivaled kingdoms. For a century, the Baltic bent to their will, and the world saw that students could surpass their teachers. Their defeat came not from failure, but from the tide of history, the relentless march of crusades, kingdoms and faiths determined to grind them down. And yet, for that 100 years when their banners flew, they carried forward the Viking legacy of terror on the sea. They proved that fear could change hands, that the hunted could become the hunters, and that the echoes of the longship still haunted Europe, only now under Wendish sails.